So to start us off with, I'd like to tell you a story about Moore when he went into a Dublin bookshop and he asked the assistant in the bookshop if they had any books by the Irish writer Bram Moore, to which the assistant was quite puzzled, but he went off and had a look in the back and he came back and said, no, there are no Irish writers called Bram Moore, but we do have some by a Canadian author called Bram Moore. And that maybe that story illustrates why we have with us today a Canadian writer, Bran Busby. Thanks for joining us today, Bran. As I say, Bran's a writer, anthologist, and literary historian. His first book, called Character Parts, which was published in 2003, deals with those characters that have inspired Canadian literature. He's best known for his book, A Gentleman of Pleasure, which was published in 2011, and that's his biography of award-winning poet, translator, memoirist John Glasgow. And Busby's most recent book, The Dusky Bookcase, is an exploration of Canada's forgotten, neglected and suppressed writing, which again gives you a clue as to why we have Bram with us here today, discussing the work of Moore. So our speaker today, Bran, is Montrealer, born and raised and educated, and he now lives with his wife and 2 dogs close to Ottawa, or not too far from Ottawa. So Bran, maybe you could introduce yourself a bit and explain to us why, as a Canadian historian and author, you became interested in Moore's early work.
Thank you. As you said, I was born, raised, and educated in Montreal. And when growing up, attending school, we didn't read Canadian literature at all. It was never assigned to us. So I attended Ellencroft Elementary School, Beaconsfield High School, John Abbott College, and it wasn't until I got to Concordia University, my very first semester, that I was introduced to Moore as a writer. I'm not even sure if I'd heard of him before, although he'd lived for 10 years in Montreal. Our Montreal lives didn't overlap at all because he left before I was born. But the book that was assigned was The Luck of Ginger Coffee, which I know, it's probably one of his better books, certainly his most comedic book. And I know the film will be shown later as part of the festival. And I liked it so much that the summer that followed, I just read everything I could by Moore. In the back of all this was the idea that he had a secret catalog of books, one might say. I mean, certainly a catalog of books, a series of books he didn't acknowledge, he didn't want to acknowledge, somewhere written under pseudonyms. And I was intrigued by that. And as we'll discuss, there are 7 in total, all paperback originals published in the 1950s. And I collected those as a, in the pre-internet days, very, very slowly collected them, but never read them. And I think I never read them because I knew very well he didn't think much of them. And they were objects to me. We had him later in life, or skipping forward a few decades, I became good friends with one of Brian Moore's good friends, a man named William Weintraub. And he encouraged me to read those books. So I thought, well, if Bill's telling me, I'll read them. And I thought they were really fascinating. They're very good works. They're his early novels. Judith Hearn was recognized by him as his first novel, and I'm happy to describe it as his first novel, but it wasn't really. There were several novels that preceded that. To me, it's a very intriguing aspect of his life, and it shows him as an early writer developing his craft. I think one can see that through the novels. Yeah. They seem to get better and better as they go along. So it's an interesting, unexplored part of his career.
And I believe that you saw him speak on a number of occasions.
I did see him speak twice. The last time he was promoting The Statement. This is in Vancouver. I wrote about it in my last book because it's the worst reading I ever went to, the worst event I've ever gone to, and just cringeworthy. Not his part was wonderful, He was always very good at reading, very personable. I think I always had the impression he felt it was part of the job. So it wasn't that he was really enjoying being on stage. It was more that he knew he had to do this and he was okay with doing it. The bad part was the Q&A after, which.
So take note for the end of today.
But you know, some of the stereotypical Q&A questions about, oh, tell me about your writing method. Do you write in the morning? Do you write in the evening? How do you write? What should I do to become a writer? Should I follow your example? Should I, this sort of thing. And it seemed that it just went on and on. And sadly, he was not being rescued by the person who's in charge of PR. So the very last time I actually saw him was in the bar afterwards.
Yeah, where all the best discussions happen.
So I sent him a drink and I didn't bother him. He was by himself. I thought he's unwinding.
And so we pick up on the fact of him being a Canadian writer. Obviously, he's Belfast born, and I'm going to share a screen here of Moore in Canada in the early years in Canada. So if you just bear with me here, and maybe you could tell us a bit about the photograph that we see here.
Yeah, so that's Moore on the left with Bill Weintraub, who I was speaking about just earlier, on the right. You know, you and I have had a little discussion about how different Moore looks now
we were trying to work out
as to how he looked later in life. Yeah. And I think you suggested that the reason is evident right under their noses, really. So yeah, Moore came to Canada in 1948, and he gave a couple of, this is him in Montreal, very in the early 50s, but he came to Canada in 48, and I think this has something to do with, well, he always gave two stories as to why he came to Canada. One was that he had a relationship with a woman named Margaret Swanson. They were both, they met because they were working for the same UN agency, something called the UN Relief and, I almost have to look this up, Rehabilitation Administration. And she had instigated the relationship. She had also broken up the relationship. And he had heard she'd returned to Canada. She was a girl from Saskatchewan. And so one story is that he basically followed or emigrated to Canada in the hopes of seeing her again. Landing in Toronto, I don't know how familiar you are with Canadian geography, but you're very far away from Saskatchewan if you're in Toronto. The other explanation he gave is that he'd been doing just a bit of journalism, but not much, and was told that by somebody at Canada House in London that it was fairly easy to get a job working for a newspaper in Canada. So that, you know, to actually be on staff. He
had traveled a bit before that as well, hadn't he, with the army? He'd seen quite a lot of the world before he arrived in Canada.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was in Italy that he met Margaret Swanson, for example. So he had been doing.
He was working in Canada. He came to Canada. Let's give him the romantic notion of chasing for love in Canada. He arrives. He gets a job as, I think, first of all, as a kind of copy editor, which, in his opinion, seemed to be the kind of lowest of the low, and then worked his way up to journalism.
Well, I think the very first job he got was given to him by the government, and it was to just be a glorified clerk looking over, doing paperwork up in northern Ontario. This is February 1948. So we're talking the second coldest month of the year in Canada. And I would have thought that would be enough to make anyone turn around and go back. But it had the opposite effect. He was very much, he loved the open spaces, this wilderness, and just kind of, I guess, the rawness of what he was seeing. And I know initially he because he entered in Toronto, he was in Toronto, and then eventually moved to Montreal, fell in love with the city. He did write one article about how much he loved Montreal, and it had to do with one of the things that made him fall in love with Montreal was the burlesque dancer Louis Saint-Cyr, who used to perform at a place called the Gaiety Theater, and she's quite famous actually. I mean, if people know about burlesque, she was very famous in her day, and despite her name, she was not French Canadian or French from France. She was an American who'd come to Montreal to dance. So so you're right. He did get a job with the Montreal Gazette, much like Ginger Coffee does, and through kind of getting an in through an acquaintance who he knew. But it was within a matter of months that he had his own byline in the Gazette. He was working as a journalist, and so by April 1949, I think it was April 1949, he had his first byline. So it'd only been at the Gazette a few months and had risen up the ranks quite quickly. To anyone familiar with The Luck of Ginger Coffee, the character of McGregor is based on a man named Harry Larkin, who was the editor of the Gazette, and he was the man who really recognized Moore's talent as a writer.
Yeah, and you're talking about with the burlesque culture, how I kind of fell in love with that, and that gives us an insight, maybe the first step towards how he was drawn to the genre of pulp fiction. I'm going to share some slides here. Maybe you could talk us through the city, and because as I was explaining to you, for us Canada is kind of bears and maple syrup. We don't really associate it with that kind of gritty urban literature pulp fiction. So I'll share maybe you could tell us about these photographs and how they relate to Moore's influences for pulp fiction.
Sure. So this is downtown Montreal as it was when he was living in Montreal, which is 1948 to 1959. And it was really known for its nightclub life. It was considered an open city, which is kind of a remarkable thing when you consider what the rest of the province of Quebec was like, which was very, very conservative. Montreal had its conservative side, but was a very different place. So anyway, just to get back to the clubs, there were jazz clubs, there were burlesque clubs. A lot of jazz musicians liked to come to Montreal because there was no coming up from the States, because there's nothing like segregation up here. You could get a hotel room if you were Black. You didn't have to go to a specific hotel. It didn't matter what hotel you were going to. So there were, as I say, nightclubs. There was a lot of illegal gambling, a lot of brothels, a lot of drinking. And a little bit of this, the seeds of this were planted in some ways by Prohibition in the United States, which Canada didn't have. Montreal was the biggest city in Canada at the time and remained so right up until the early 70s. And it was a very cosmopolitan city, a very sophisticated city, I would say, and had a very interesting melange of different cultures. During Prohibition, you would get a lot of people like, New Yorkers would come up to Montreal to have a good time, but Torontonians would come to Montreal to have a good time. It was known as a place, I don't want to say it was like Las Vegas, but it was a place where, what you do in Montreal stays in Montreal. I don't know that that's true, but you could get away from everything and no one would know what you were doing as you were misbehaving.
And so do you think
it was an exciting, vibrant city? And of course, with that comes a lot of organized crime and a lot of corrupt politicians and police on the take. So all of these would feed into that pulp fiction that he was.
And as a journalist, these are the people that he would have been reporting stories on. So he was getting an insight into this seedy kind of underbelly of society. But as we discussed with it, the books, the pulp fiction books, and he was writing them, it was definitely a way of making money because they were quite well paid. I mean, you were pointing out to me that he was paid 10 times more for his pulp fiction novels than he received for Judith Hearn initially.
Yes, well, there's I think it was 55 that Andre Deutsch gave him his advance for Judith Hearn, which is a book he worked on for, you know, quite some time, unlike his pulp novels, which were 160-page things that he could often dash off quite quickly. And his journalism, he would often do pieces, pieces for, say, the Weekend magazine, which was a supplement one would find in the Montreal Star, or the Montreal Gazette. He would do a piece that he could knock off in an afternoon for $275. Well, Judith Hearn, he received the equivalent of $227 for as an advance from Andre Deutsch. That was in 55. In the previous year, he had received $2,500
Wow.
as an advance for French for Murder, which is one of his pulp novels. So you can see this huge discrepancy where his serious writing wasn't lucrative in any sense.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Sorry, I think I've got my...
So yes, yeah, I mean, do you think that that is, again, one of the reasons, is, you know, his later relationship with the novels, where he kind of distanced himself from them? Do you think he always considered them just as something that he did to make money? They didn't, in his opinion, they didn't have literary merit?
I think so. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but the only thing I can remember him saying about the literary novels, the only complimentary thing, the only complimentary thing I can think of him saying about the pulp novels was they enabled him to write Judith Hearn. So they gave him the money that he needed to write Judith Hearn, because if he was going to be spending all that time working on a novel that brought, as I say, $227 after, you know, a couple of years' work, you couldn't feed a family on that, certainly. And although later he, as it turned out, Judith Hearn is probably ended up being probably his most lucrative novel. You know, just kept making money for him year after year. I don't think it's ever been out of print. And of course, there was a film adaptation, and it was optioned many, many times for films over the years before that adaptation was made. So in the end, it was a good story. It just took a long time to pay off.
A long time. Well, the first 7 novels, we've been describing them here as pulp fiction. Maybe you could tell us a bit about the genre in Canada.
Sure. You know, in some ways, it's an American import in terms of ideas, or in terms of format and everything else. They were typically, they were books sold at you know, newsagents, train stations, drugstore spinner racks. Always had a bit of a disposable feel to them. They were published on, you know, on paper that wasn't much better than just pure pulp, which is why they're becoming increasingly rare. They fall apart in your hand if you read them today, typically. They were also seen as as being something disposable, perhaps because they were sold with magazines and newspapers. So it was just more of the same. You know, people tend not to keep magazines, or certainly not newspapers, unless there's something quite unusual about it. They also kind of exploited a market that was growing very quickly after the Second World War. My father was part of this market, where you had a lot of men who had been in the war, served in, were now living in suburbia, new suburbia, taking the train in the morning and reading kind of things that might be more adventurous than their work at wherever they were working, you know, the insurance company and that sort of thing. Now, you can see that by the 2 examples, that they tended to have very lurid, eye-catching colors and covers, I should say, the illustrations. One of the reasons that the picture, or the title is always at the top, is in the racks. You'd have these racks and they'd be layered like this, so you could read the title. And hopefully see at least a little bit of the woman who's always featured on the cover. They always made it sound like the sexiest thing in the world. I have a copy of William Faulkner's Sanctuary that you would think is the filthiest book ever written. Very disappointing when I did read it at the age of 14. So I've chosen these two because there were three Canadian companies involved in the post-war paperback trade. One was Newsstand Library. That's one of their examples. Sugarpuss, also known as Sugarpuss on Dorchester Street, is on the left. The one on the right is an early Harlequin, the body on Mount Royal being the mountain in the center of Montreal. And I chose these two for a couple of reasons. One is they're typical of their time, but also they have such a focus on Montreal. So people who would come to Montreal from other parts of the country for a good time, they knew Mount Royal, they knew Dorchester Street. Dorchester Street back in those days was actually the center of the nightclubs in Montreal, which is remarkable to me because when I was a young person first going to Montreal, it was just, or first, living in Montreal, it was just antiseptic. This is a sort of, these are two examples of his competition. You can see from his own books that the publishers, kind of did exactly the same thing. And the one I think I should probably add that one of the fascinating things about the book on the right, the early Harlequin, is we think of Harlequin today as a romance line, but in its early days, they published a lot of westerns, a lot of thrillers, a lot of mysteries, so nothing like what we know think of them today.
And it's the cultural melting pot that we discussed in terms of the culture of Montreal at the time, where there's a European influence in it, there's an American influence in it. Are these reflected in these books? Is it kind of reflective of those styles?
It's funny, they're reflected in some and not in others. And I think it says more about the author than it does the actual, that it says more about the author than it does about the city. Montreal, had a very strong English community, Protestant English, very, that were in some ways quite separate from the French-speaking community. And the Irish were interesting because they kind of had a bit of a foot in both worlds. Because it was Irish Catholic, they married a lot of, it's very common, it's almost uncommon not to have an Irish grandmother or great-grandmother in a French-Canadian family. There's somebody going to be in there at some point. But the thing about the Irish is the Irish in Montreal tend to be quite poor. The English, and when I say English, it was really Anglos and Scots, and definitely the Scots, who in some ways really built up the industry in Montreal. And if anyone knows anything about Canadian history, our first prime minister was born and raised in Scotland, John A. Macdonald, came to Canada as a 13-year-old. Second prime minister, Alexander Mackenzie, another Scot who came to Canada to make his money. So there's actually a really good book by Ken McGugan called How the Scots Created Canada, which argues, that it was the Scots who really started the country in terms of making it a unified entity.
So Muir's stepping into this world with these this particular genre and the ideas with these publishers, and he then writes effectively 7 books in as many years, maybe slightly less.
Yeah,
So
he did.
we're going to move on and we're going to have a look. We're doing these in chronological order, so we're going to have a look at some of the, as you say, amazing covers, which unfortunately, as you've described, sometimes have a disconnect from the actual content. So we'll look at the first one, and the first 2 Moore published under his own name, I believe.
Yes, they're the only two. Yeah, so Wreath for a Redhead is the very first. I've always thought it was kind of a shame that his name doesn't appear on the cover, although it's on the title page in the spine. You can see Montreal means murder. So right away, he's, the publisher, which at this point, Harlequin had just moved from Winnipeg to Toronto as their center of operation. But they're selling it as a Montreal paperback. I know we'll talk about this book later, but it's pretty. It's a pretty great cover, and we never see the murder. We don't. So this is an imagined scene.
Okay. And I know we're going to talk in a bit more depth about this one as well.
Yes, I always thought, the Executioners. So there you are, the second one, and I've always thought it was funny that he had these great titles. One of which I'll discuss later, was kind of inflicted upon him, except for this title, which seems the blandest thing. And again, we'll be talking about this, but essentially it's about hitmen who've been on Montreal.
From his journalistic training, you can kind of see the book titles, other than this one, as you say, are almost like miniature headlines that tell the whole story, and with the compression of a headline. So you can, I can see from a journalist perspective how it's influenced these. So his next book then is
okay, French for Murder. French for Murder is the first book that is not set in Montreal. So it's his third pulp. It's the first to employ this pseudonym Bernard Marat. Now, if you gold medal, or Fawcett Gold Medal, as it's sometimes known, it was a kind of the paperback house you wanted to be with if you were writing this sort of stuff. It was Fawcett Gold Medal that gave them that gave Moore the $2,500 for one of his pulps. And you can see it's, they make a big point of saying this is an original book, it's not a reprint. Print runs tended to be about 200,000, and then that was usually it. That was, it was on sale. You could get it maybe for a month or two at a newsstand, and then it was gone. This one in particular, I thought I'd read. I've got the book right here, and there's a wonderful little publisher's pitch at the back that I love, because it's not Brian Moore who's writing this; it's Bernard Marat, and what it says is, introducing Bernard Marat, bright new challenger for hard-boiled honors with a knack for arranging words and events in the manner born to violence. French for Murder, a trial by terror. And when you get to the end of every Bernard Marat book, it always says the end of a Bernard Marat book. So clearly I know he was, by this point in his life, he was working on Judith Hearne and had decided he was going to reserve his true name for his actual literary output and then try and hide behind pseudonyms. And very often, if you went to a place like Fawcett Gold Medal, you would be asked for a new pseudonym because they didn't want anything to do with, they didn't want to help their rivals. In this case, it's the first book he did for an American publisher. So after he left Harlequin, all the thrillers were with American publishers. So Bullet for My Lady, very typical, probably the worst, I could say, the weakest of his books. I always have to refer to these things. I should have said one thing about French for Murder, which is very interesting, and that is that it's the first one of his novels to feature an American as the hero. Mm-hmm. And he did write in a letter to Mordecai Richler, fellow Montreal writer, that he was trying to write like an American when he was doing it. So
And have you any insight why? Is it because it's an American publisher? Did he have an
I think
eye
it
on
was
the
because it
American
was an
market?
American publisher. This one's set in Paris. Interestingly, none of his thrillers are actually set in the United States. This one's Paris. Bullet for My Lady is Barcelona. And this was the one, unless I'm mistaken, no, I'm right about that. This is the one that came out just before Judith Hearn. So you can see it's probably a good idea not to have his name on the cover if he wanted to be taken seriously as a serious novelist, which he did.
And were these books that have the American publisher, were they published only in Canada, or did they have an international market? What would have kind of provoked them to?
These would have been published in the States, but they would have been brought into Canada because they had a Canadian distributor. So they were really going after the American market. You know, Canada at the time was, I don't know, 16 million people. So printing anything as 200,000 print run would have been insane.
Yeah.
You know, so This Gun for Gloria, I love this as a title because the main character is a man, again an American. His name's I got it down here. Yes, Mitch Cannon. Mitch Cannon is a kind of down and out journalist who's finds himself in Paris, and a woman comes to ask him to find his daughter or her daughter Gloria, who's gone missing, and he reluctantly does agree to do that. But it's fascinating as a title because Mitch doesn't have a gun, and that's not Gloria on the cover. She's a blonde. I have no idea who that is. I don't think that's Mitch. That scene does not take place in the book, but you can see the marketing that's going on here where people, you know, it looks like such a great cover, and they set out to murder Gloria. I set out to catch the slugs. Actually, he set out to kind of find out where Gloria was. He didn't know where she was. Did he set out to catch the slugs? One gun is fired in error in the book. No one's shot.
That gives a kind of
publisher at work.
Do you have any kind of insight into the relationship here between the marketing of the books and the writing of the books? I mean, do the two of them ever kind of speak to each other before the book's published?
I
decide the cover
not.
and the title and
yeah, I think not. And you know, I was going to read this, but I'll just give you a quick taste. At the very end of at the back of this book, at the back of this book, there's something written by Mitch in the first person, and Mitch is the narrator of the story, but these are not Moore's words. And it says, "I'm Mitch Cannon, and I agreed to look for her when her mother put the bundle of francs in my hand. That was the beginning. I never reckoned on ending in a Paris studio with the rain beating down outside the Paris morning drawing to an end, with a naked girl dying beside me in the thick, sweet smell of escaping gas in the room, sweet drug death on a wooden floor." Moore did not write those words. They do not appear in the book. So it's you can see the publisher really getting, really going after that market, really trying to entice the commuter into spending his 25 cents on the book.
And how would other people have felt when they saw people reading these sorts of books, whether it be on the train or whether it be on the bus or during their commute? Would they seem as slightly salacious? Would ladies have crossed the street? Have they seen gentlemen reading these sorts of books? Or what was the feel for them in Canada at the time?
Yeah. Well, the nice thing is they're so small you can practically hide the cover with the palm of your hand as you're reading it, and it could be that you might be reading a Penguin classic and no one would know the difference. You could be reading Jane Eyre. I know they talk about this with 50 Shades of Grey, and how it was the Kindle that made 50 Shades of Grey, because you could be reading anything. This is kind of, this precedes that in a way. Yeah.
And
Intent to
then,
Kill. He switches to Dell, another American company, which were with Fawcett. They were the best paying. I'm not exactly sure why he switched, except that he typically signed with Harlequin. He signed a 2-book deal. With Fawcett, he signed a 3-book deal. So it's possible that he just got better money from Dell. So now the pseudonym is Michael Bryan. With this one, he returns to Montreal, and I'll discuss that. This one a bit later. It's a really interesting book, too, in one respect, in that it was actually published in the UK as a hardcover. So this is the first of his books to be published in the UK, but of course published under a pseudonym, so no one knew who Michael Bryan was, even though Michael Bryan was the author of Judith Hearn at the time.
Yeah. And have you come across any ideas of where he got the pseudonyms from? Was he just kind of, how was he randomly selecting the names? Are they connected to anybody, friends, family, or?
Well, I've seen in manuscripts that he's done for abandoned novels. He had used the name Bryan frequently, or Brian, I suppose. Use that frequently. Michael was the name of his son.
So he's actually creating a character as the writer of the book.
Yes, I think so.
Actually creating a character in the way that he realizes the characters in the book. He's inventing a character for himself.
Definitely, and he's following a certain sort of. I think he's seeing it less of his voice than a voice he's creating. So, they typically, these novels are told in the first person, kind of tough guys. This one really stands out in a lot of ways because, as you can see, it seems to involve a hospital. There's nobody carrying a gun there, although the scalpel looks kind of threatening. It was just before this that he'd written to Mordecai Richler about writing for money, and how he felt that the books that you wanted to write wouldn't earn money. These would earn money to help you do that, and then gave Richler a bit of a lesson on how to do it. And so it was short paragraphs, chapters of 10 pages, thereabouts. And his last thing is, write like Hemingway, but with more sock and bash.
Now, I know we're going to come back to examine this book in a bit more detail. So just look at his last pulp fiction book then. Can you tell us a bit about?
Murder in Mallorca is probably my favorite of all the titles. I'll tell you why. Does take place in Mallorca. There is no murder. The death that people think is a murder turns out to be an accident. So this was
an accident in Mallorca is not going to sell.
Accident in Mallorca
quite as well.
Unfortunate incident in Mallorca. So I'm just trying to. This one's kind of interesting because. Yes, this is what it was. He wanted to call it Free Ride Home, which is not a very sexy title, really. And this book came out just after Feast of Lupercal. And so this is the very last of his pulps. So the book that came after this is The Luck of Ginger Coffee. And from that point on, there are no pulps.
Yeah.
I think he managed to, get a certain footing by that time. So he abandoned the pulps and really the thriller genre.
And do you think he kind of considered himself, because you can almost see that period of journalism ending, and then he goes on to consider himself then and to work as a novelist. So, from my perspective with this, I don't know whether you agree with this or not, Bran, the pulp fiction aspect of his work sort of runs in parallel with the journalism. It's almost the journalism of the imagination. And then he kind of sets that down and goes into a different mode within his career, which there are other events on as part of the festival that are going to be looking at different aspects of his career. But this particular book marks the end, he finishes that journalistic pulp fiction genre writing and moves into something else. Would that be a correct summation of it?
Yeah, I think so. There's a certain amount of, you could say there's a certain amount of, there are certain aspects that remind one of journalism, and in a strange way, travel writing, which he also done quite a bit of, because he focuses on one thing that really sets him apart from the people he studied. And he did study the competition, the American competition in particular, to learn what it was these publishers wanted. And we see that one of the things that sets him apart from them is he's very good and spends a little more time than they would, actually in some cases much more time than they would, on setting up the atmosphere, like or just the setting. You know, whether it's Paris or Montreal or Barcelona, you get a sense of what this place is like, what its bars are like. And it's not just some guy who's writing about Barcelona who hasn't been to Barcelona. So the bar is like any old bar in New York, you know.
Yeah.
It's there's a real talent there for doing that.
And we're going to look just very quickly in detail. You've picked out three. Maybe you can
Yep.
tell us why you picked these particular three and what's important about them. So we're starting with Wreath for a Redhead.
Yeah, well, Wreath for a Redhead is his first, so I thought let's start off with that. And Wreath for a Redhead, it begins in Lévis, which is across the street from Quebec City. A man named John Reardon, and this is very common in Moore's books, where you'll have a character who's not from Ireland. In this case, Reardon is from Saskatchewan, but he has an Irish name. So clearly of some Irish heritage. And Reardon is on a train, meets a redheaded woman. They get to talking. By the time they get to Montreal, they take a hotel room together. They have a very nice time. Then they go out for dinner, and she goes to powder her nose and disappears. And the next day she reappears, but only very briefly. And then is the next thing we know, she's been murdered. And it's a bit of a you know, Hitchcockian wrong man situation, where of course Reardon is the one that the police are looking for because they think he's the murderer. Yeah. It turns out that she had been involved in an extortion ring, and he has her notebook. He knows who was being blackmailed, and in order to try and find out who the murderer is, and clear his own name, he goes chasing down everyone who's been blackmailed. One of these people is a woman named, what's her name again? Simone. But Simone is the daughter of French Canadian and an Irish Canadian. So she, you know, which is also a very typical blending he has in all his, well, in not all his books, but in a lot of his books. And of course, this is the same background his first wife had, that same mix, and very common in Montreal. At the end of it, he ends up marrying Simone. It's kind of a bad ending that way. Not that it's, I don't mean to imply that it's an unhappy ending. It's just a bit of a weak ending that way. But you know, it's a man who's now sowed his wild oats. He's learned better from doing that. Now he's going to settle down. I should add that the woman the redhead who's murdered, her name is Joan Harlow, not to be confused with Jean Harlow. Yeah. Well, she's a redhead, not a blonde.
And Executioners?
Executioner's song is interesting. That's the name. This is about an Eastern European leader hiding in exile, and he there's a a man named, so the hero this time out is Mike Farrell. Mike Farrell is another Canadian. Actually, we don't even know that he's Canadian. Harlequin says that on the cover, that he's Canadian, but Moore never says what his nationality is. One might assume he's Canadian, but you don't know. The one thing I'll also say is that is, if anyone's ever been to Montreal, that is a very atypical Montreal building. It looks like it was drawn by somebody who's never been to Montreal. But essentially, hired assassins move in from the States to kill this exiled Eastern European leader. The implication is that the Soviet Union probably wants him out of the way. It's interesting in a lot of, in some regards. It's not one of his stronger books, but it's interesting because that Eastern European leader seems to be based on. Okay, here's where I'm going to read. Stanislaw Mokolecek, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, who was at one point the leader of post-war Poland, or at least aspiring to be the leader of post-war Poland, and was one of the first people Moore ever interviewed as a journalist.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, that he wrote a piece on the disappearance of that leader for the Dublin Sunday Independent.
Yeah.
So one of his first published pieces.
So he's definitely drawn from his journalistic experience and combining that within the genre, and looking obviously towards Hollywood as well there with the film noir. You know, it's got kind of feel for it. And the last one we're looking at then is Intent to Kill, which is your favorite of all the.
It's my favorite of all of them. Again, it's a Montreal book. This was the first one that was published in the UK. Murder in Mallorca was also published in the UK, both as hardcovers. Intent to Kill has a very interesting history because it was written when, well, it certainly draws upon, I should say, an experience Moore had where he was a summer of 1953, July, he was swimming in a lake in the Laurentians and was struck on the head by a motorboat. Ended up in the Montreal Neurological Institute, which was fortunately one of the very best places to go in the entire world. You know, the closest place is, it was the closest place and happened to be just about the best place for that sort of brain injury. His skull was fractured in 6 places. It was thought he might not be able to talk again. It was thought he might not be able to write again. In fact, both were wrong. But he certainly drew upon that experience because this book is about a South American leader who has suffered a brain injury as a result of a botched assassination attempt. It has come to Montreal for surgery. And as in the executioners, the assassins move in from the Americans, from the United States, or hired assassins. They presumably in the employ of the South American government, the South American interests who tried to assassinate the leader. And I think there are 2 things that I think are striking about this particular novel. Well, one is more of in terms of the history of Moore's career, in that this is the first of his books to be made into a movie, and I thought quite successful. It stars Richard Todd. It was made the next year. All the exterior scenes are shot in Montreal, so if you ever get a chance to see it, the trailer's up on YouTube. I know from time to time the movie itself appears. You get a sense of what Montreal was like from the outside, at least. The interiors were shot in England. And one of the fun things about the film for film buffs is if you look carefully, you'll see very young Jackie Collins in one of her very first film roles and one of her only film roles. But the thing I find most interesting about it is I find this is the best written of all the thrillers, although This Gun for Gloria and Murder in Mallorca are close second and thirds. So you can see that he was getting better as a writer of novels, one might say. And the other thing is it kind of deals with themes that we see repeatedly, or at least elements we see repeatedly in Moore's fiction. For example, failed marriage, infidelity, doctors. His father was a doctor. We see a lot of doctors in Moore's fiction. Of course, Cold Heaven also recreates that, or it recreates that scene that, or Moore's experience in getting hit by a motorboat while swimming. So in Intent to Kill, just to summarize it very briefly, we have a doctor. His nationality is never really identified. He's probably American. He's living in Montreal. His wife is definitely American. She's unhappy in Montreal because she doesn't like the weather. She goes down to Boston frequently, is having an affair, probably more than one affair, and is very intent on getting him to return to the United States, which offers slightly warmer weather, even though it's Boston, but certainly much more money. And it's the money she really wants. She doesn't, they live in a very comfortable lifestyle, but she wants to live in affluence. He's basically, I don't want to say he's married to his job, but the job is more important than the money to him. He feels he's doing a lot of good. And so she decides she's going to blackmail him, or at least she threatens to blackmail him by going to the director of the hospital to say that her husband is having an affair with a female doctor. And which isn't true at all, but during the course of this thriller, he realizes that he is in fact in love with the female doctor and not his wife, of course. And that's, so we see these, as I say, we see these elements that that we're going to see more in his fiction going forward, that are basically absent in the ones that came before.
We were discussing there, you know, how he was influenced by a massive different influences. He's obviously bringing his own experiences of growing up in Belfast, his journalistic experiences, the cultural melting pot of Montreal, the influence of the Hollywood noir genre. And that takes us then where we'll conclude with, he actually went on to work with Hitchcock on Torn Curtain. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, apparently Hitchcock at the time was being kind of pressured to produce a hit. His previous two films, The Birds and Marnie, interestingly, The Birds surprised me, had not been successes. The Hollywood studios really wanted a hit, and they were pressuring him for a sort of James Bond sort of hit, you know, because Bond was now very big. And so the idea was that he would do a Cold War thriller, but the first person he approached was Vladimir Nabokov, who turned him down just as well, because Nabokov, as people who might know the story from his work on Lolita, was not a screenwriter. He didn't know how to write screenplays. And Moore took him up on it rather reluctantly, but he was being offered $50,000. And he at the time was under a bit of financial pressure. And so took it. One of the things I find so fascinating fascinating about all this is one would think, oh, well, yes, of course, Moore was suggested to him because he'd written thrillers. Now, I don't know if anyone knew he'd written thrillers, really. I mean, the two ones that had appeared under his name, one had appeared in the States in '53, but the others had only appeared in Canada, and one wonders whether he knew. But the real attraction for Hitchcock was that Moore had become known in a very short period of time as somebody who could really write female characters and things from female perspective. And Hitchcock's idea for this film had to do not so much with what was happening to the man, but how the woman was reacting, presumably a wife or a girlfriend. And they went from there. And it seemed to be a very good relationship for the longest time. until it was so good, in fact, that Hitchcock offered him $225,000 for 3 more screenplays, and Moore was tempted, and here we kind of circle back to his thrillers in some way, not because he wanted the money, but because he thought, if I have that money, then I'll write those, and then I can write the books I want to write. And
time for writing.
always looking for a way to do what he wanted to do. Anyway, Moore did turn him down, and then I might be getting a sequence of events out of a little askew, but then what happened was that he started to have doubts about the screenplay, and he and Hitchcock had a real collaborative sort of back and forth about which was very typical of Hitchcock. He wasn't actually writing it, but was in on the creative process and giving feedback. And then Moore all of a sudden had doubts, and Hitchcock basically set him loose. I mean, there's more to the story than that, but brought in 2 other screenwriters. Then there was a whole fight over who was going to get credits. In the end, Moore won. So it's interesting in that regard. I always thought it was fascinating that it was Moore's ability to write the female character that really attracted Hitchcock, not the idea that you're a thriller writer and I want a Cold War thriller.
Well, to be fair, it's Hitchcock. I don't think he really kind of needed a thriller writer, with the fact that it's right. So yeah, I hadn't actually thought of that. That makes a really good point, that it was actually more about his realization of his female characters, which some people link to the fact that he was raised with 5 sisters, and he had a kind of good insight into the female voice. And but it's interesting that that's what's attracted Hitchcock to him.
Well, if I can say one more thing about it, it's that people often talk about this scene, if you're familiar with Torn Curtain, in which Paul Newman kills an assassin. And it's a very, very long scene. It takes place, I think it's in a French country kitchen, using everything you can think of, the frying pan, whatever, and finally sticks his head into a gas oven, turns on the gas, and holds the head down so he can only breathe in the gas. And Moore's, remember reading one interview with him where he said, it always bothered me how easily killing is portrayed in books and in television and in movies, and that's why I put that in, because it's not a simple, it's not always a headshot and it's over. And we see this also in his thrillers, where it's often quite hard to kill someone, particularly in Intent to Kill. The assassins who come in have every opportunity, they planned it, and it's botched. Nothing works. So the opportunity doesn't present itself. You've got this great plan, it doesn't happen, or you think it's going to happen, it doesn't happen. So it's fascinating that again, there's that link from his thrillers to right into the film. And the last thing I want to say about his thrillers is, of course, when I say he abandoned his thrillers, he didn't, because so many years later, he returned with a thriller in The Color of Blood, and I think No Other Life is a fantastic thriller, and as is a statement. So curiously, at the end of his life, he went back to a genre that he'd previously not even acknowledged having been part of, and returned to it.
And in conclusion of our discussion, to take us right back to where we started, the debate between him being an Irish writer or a Canadian writer, I believe you've got some interesting stuff to share with us on that.
Yeah, I thought I've been thinking about this.
We were discussing earlier how maybe this is one of the things that has made Moore hard to categorize, hard to kind of pin down, particularly within literature, that the marketing people, although obviously not with the Pulp Fiction, they didn't really care what the writer wrote or where they were from. They headed off in their own direction. But and with his other work, there's always a tendency to want to kind of categorize, and he does fall between particular national designations. So over the whole kind of question of I mean, I'm happy to share them with you, Bran, but over the question of Irish
Oh.
or Canadian.
I've always clutched him to my bosom, but I will say that, you know, one of the things that I love about what's happening in Ireland now is that I feel that nothing similar is happening in Canada, which is not unusual. I mean, this is typical of the way we treat particularly our writers once they're dead. We don't really pay too much attention to them anymore, and it doesn't matter who it is. I mean, you could ask anyone, you know, about how much do we hear about Robertson Davies anymore, or Mordecai Richler, or Carol Shields. But it's interesting because I'd be interested to know what you think about what he had to say about his relationship with Ireland. This comes, actually, let me first do the Canadian side of this. This comes from an interview we did in 1979 for Quarry magazine, which is a little magazine that doesn't exist anymore in Canada. He said, "I'm irritated when I'm not treated as a Canadian. Canadians tend to ignore the fact that I use Canada and Canadian characters in many of my novels. I'm dependent on Canada for at least half of my political terrain, or my literary terrain. I feel at home here in the social sense. My brother is Canadian, so are my wife, nephews, and nieces. Most of my oldest friends are Canadian." And then he's asked, "So would you come back to Canada from Malibu? Do you ever think you'll come back?" Because he had a house in Malibu. And his response was, "When the state of California eventually expropriates my property." Now, in fact, he did, in a sense, come back because he would summer in Nova Scotia, and he eventually built a house on the Atlantic in Nova Scotia. So he would spend the less warm Nova Scotia months in Malibu and live in Nova Scotia for the rest, where his wife was from. As I say, he took out, you know, as you might imagine, he took out Canadian citizenship and certainly had an attachment with Canada. But this is from a 1980 BBC documentary that I find fascinating. So these are his words. He said, "Here in the west of Ireland, I'm in touch with ordinary lives, in touch yet not in touch, for I am a stranger among the local people, after all. I have it easy compared to the harsh realities of their lives. I know that I am an exile and that my condition is irreversible. From now on in Ireland, I will always be on the outside looking in. I will see people not as they really are, but as I imagine them to be."
Oh.
Now, I'm not Irish, so I can't speak to, I think he's doing himself a disservice, but, you know, but I'll leave that to you to answer.
So we're just
Do you
coming up.
feel he was on the outside looking in?
No, I think probably what he was doing was laying down an insurance policy so that, you know, if he ever came back to Ireland and people were accusing him of being an outsider, you know, he's covered his back on that one. And sadly, as we discussed actually earlier on, his Malibu home is no longer there from it was lost in the fires. Yeah.
Yes, well, burnt to the ground in 2018, and I think I was saying to you, I have a friend who lost his Malibu home in the very same fire. So I'm familiar with Moore's home from having driven past. And one of the sad things about the house is you can see some before and after photos. If you go online, there's nice Los Angeles Times piece about this tragedy. The nice thing about it is that his papers have been moved. So his personal library appears to have been lost, but not his papers. And
if you don't mind, we've just one or two questions here just to finish us off. I know we're slightly running over time here, so we'll do this as quickly as possible. Sure. One of our attendees has asked, do you know how Moore felt about his pulp novels in retrospect? So later in his career?
Yeah, well, as I say, I met Moore twice, and I knew not to ask him about it. And the reason I didn't ask him about it is in again, Bill Weintraub, mutual friend, wrote a very good book called Starting Over, and it's about his early career, Moore's early career, and Mordecai Richler's early career, and Mavis Gallant's early career. And all of them knew each other in Montreal, were all very good friends, lifelong friends, and all began in journalism and then moved on to, not so much Richler, but the others began in journalism and went on to write. Weintraub mainly is a filmmaker. If you look in Starting Over, it really is clear that Moore did not like talking about them, even with a close friend like Bill Weintraub, and was very dismissive and seemed to be kind of, I think if Weintraub doesn't use the word irritated, he uses a synonym for irritated. I can't remember, but it was almost seen as something you didn't talk about. So it's kind of sad in a way, because, as I say, these books are slowly decomposing, basically. I mean, I've got my copies and they're getting, even though they're just sitting on shelves, they were not made to last.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to be something he really didn't want discussed.
I'll just put a call out if there's any more questions. Victoria, maybe you could just check there with us. I'm not sure if I can see all of them here. If we have any more questions that anybody would like to put to Bran. I'm just not sure if I can see all of these. And I think we're sort of running up against time here anyway. So Bran, thank you so much for your time today. It was a really enjoyable and insightful discussion. I think it's provoked maybe a lot of people like myself to go back and to have a look at some of these novels and have a look at these books. And, you know, thank you very much for your time. It's really insightful. And I also want to thank the festival organisers and for everybody else who came along to watch our discussion today. And don't forget, there's still lots more events to take part. If you want to go and see anything else that's coming up in the festival, you can find all the details on the website. I'm just going to share the screen here with you where you can get the details on that. So yes, thank you very much, Bran. Thanks for your time today. Thanks to the festival organisers, and thanks to everybody else who came along. We hope you've enjoyed our event today, and don't forget to check out the rest of the events that are coming up during the festival. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to the festival.
Thank you.